Emma in Winter by Penelope Farmer, 2. Normally, Bobby Fumpkin's quickest way home would have been along the higher edge of the downs, dropping down to the valley from the slope that lay above his own house. But today the track there was hidden by the snow. Indeed, it was likely that in such an unsheltered place the wind had piled great drifts of snow to bar the way completely. So Bobby, toward tea time, followed Emma over the meadow to the village and the hard-backed road. He went as he had come, quite alone, dragging his clumsy sled behind him. His head was bent with the effort of pulling, his breath smoked out great clouds into the frosty air. The crisp snow crunched under his feet. He was not, though, alone, unhappy. Indeed, he ached contentedly from the exercise, and having not had one bit of candy since his dinner time, he was hugely hungry for his tea. And he was pleased because he had learned to manage the sled better after the first great crashing, and had made several speedy, easy runs down the hill, reminded by them, as Emma had been, of flight and the flying summer. No one, of course, had noticed his success, but he preferred to be left neither mocked nor teased, and needed no praise to make himself pleased with his own success. Indeed, he was so content, he had almost forgotten Marley and Emma mocking him until Scraggs, the butchers, reminded him of Marley again, and so of Emma, and so of their mockery, and then, for a time, he almost hated them. Yet what he most wanted was to be friends with them, and with the other children, particularly to be friends with Emma, who was pretty and thin, and who seemed sometimes as lonely as he was, since Charlotte had gone away. That was why he always smiled when teased, and never answered back, though sometimes it might have been better to do just that. But at least, he thought, to comfort himself again, at least they call me Bobby now. Though he also thought that what he would really like to be called was Bob, or even Rob. But Bobby was still better than Baby or Jemima Puddle Duck. His house was right at the end of the village, where the road to the sea began to climb the downs. Once, not long ago, the village had been the neat, tight shape of a cat drawn by a child with a small bulge for a head and a bigger bulge for its body, but now the cat also had a tail, a double row of houses that lined the road right up to where the downs rose. They were copybook houses, each with two small gables, a thin front door set with a frosted panel, and a round diamond-paned bow window to the right of that. Each thin front door was a different color, and each board that hung on chains outside every porch bore a different name, but otherwise the houses were identical. The door of Bobby's house was painted a pale purple, and the board above it read, "Downside," in carefully curly letters. It was the last house in the road, and squeezed in tight under the downs, its garden a fenced-off piece of downland itself, so the name Downside was accurate enough, which was more than could be said for some of the other names, such as Burnview and Treetops farther down the road. Bobby's mother would have preferred to live nearer to the village and the village shops, and his father cursed because nothing grew easily in the garden except broom and thyme and lady's slipper. But Bobby liked the garden and liked being so close up under the downs. In summer, he would climb up to the top of them and sit looking out over the valley, remembering the flying summer and wishing it would return again, because it had seemed to him the best time of his life, though he did not choose to remember how the other children had laughed at his clumsy flight, or how it was then they had first called him Jemima Puddle Duck. The house itself, Downside, he hated. He hated it partly because everything seemed to have changed for the worse since they moved just over a year ago. He also hated its niggly windows, diamond-paned. He hated the square, neat rooms where there were no corners or cupboards or secret hiding places as there had been in the cottage where they had lived before. He hated even such things as there were no reason for hating, the round white handles on the doors. In the cottage they had all been made of brass, or the straight bars to the banisters on the stairs, like bars to a monkey cage, or so he said. But tonight, with the thick blue shadows gathering, and the air growing sharper every minute, it still seemed welcoming enough, leaking out a warm light onto the snow, and the hungry Bobby felt pleased to be home. The hall was warm and still, and the clock ticked loudly, comfortably. He could hear the clack of spoons from the kitchen, the murmur of his mother's voice, and the louder bursts of baby gabble. He unwound himself quickly from his outdoor clothes and pushed open the door quite eagerly. "Oh, Mom," he said, "I'm so hungry. I had a lovely afternoon and my sled went beautifully and... Mom." "Oh, there you are at last," said his mother hurriedly. "Your tea's in the oven and all dried up by now, I expect, but I can't help it if you're late, can I?" She was a mouse-colored, worried woman with thin, straight hair and thin, straight mouse-colored clothes. She bent close to the baby, and her voice became different altogether, crooning, "Shall Mommy give her a cookie? A sugary cookie, then?" The baby beamed at Bobby, its face all butter. But Bobby, who had been quite ready earlier to smile back and play with her, now looked deliberately away and went to fetch his withered egg, which gloomily he ate with a remarkable quantity of bread and butter, but without another word. Afterward, on his slow way upstairs, running his hands along the monkey bars, he heard the baby begin to cry. There came a burst of wailing, a pause, and then another yell so loud it would have startled him if he had not been expecting it to follow the lengthy pause while the baby drew in breath. He heard his mother fuss and comfort her. The window in his bedroom was at the side of the house, and the down pressed right up against it as if the house itself leaned on its shoulder. Tonight, all white, it looked naked and unfriendly, glittering at Bobby coldly as the moon rose, and so, for once, he was glad to draw his curtain and shut it out. But inside the room, it was cold and unfriendly too. Even when he had switched on the lamp and lit the flames of the small gas fire, the unfriendliness he knew was partly his own fault, because hating the room, he had done little to make it better, leaving most of his possessions shut up in boxes and not bothering to pin up his pictures and photographs, except for a few he had wedged into the corners of his mirror. All there was, apart from the neat pile of boxes, was his bed, a chair, a chest of drawers, and, set out on that, a few books, mostly scientific ones, and an elderly homemade model of a battleship that had begun to shed its paint. Bobby opened the top drawer of the chest. A large bar of chocolate nestled among the handkerchiefs, and he touched it, sighing, pretending he hated chocolate. He pretended so well that he even managed to push the drawer 3/4 shut again, but then he pulled it quickly back and tore off 2 squares of chocolate and thrust them in his mouth to melt smoothly and sweetly on his tongue. Those gone, he opened the drawer again and took more and then more, cramming chocolate in faster and faster, tasting it less and less, until of that whole bar only 2 squares remained, and he felt a little sick. But 2 squares of chocolate being scarcely worth the leaving, he ate those also, without enjoying them or even expecting to. And then, feeling sick and sad and sleepy, he sat down on the floor by the gas fire and started thinking about Emma. He had a quite extraordinary feeling. Since last term, as far as he knew, he had not seen her at all until that afternoon sledding, and yet he was certain that this was the second time recently she had jeered at him. Thinking, he fell asleep and was dreaming again, no longer in his bedroom in the shelter of the downland shoulder, but high above the shoulder on the snowy downs. He was flying, still clumsy, though much less clumsy than the previous dream, and even this clumsy kind of flight was better, more exciting, if harder work than more expert flight like sledding. For a time, he was quite alone and concentrated on his practicing. But then Emma was there again, also watching him with a slight small smile. Her flying was far better than Bobby's already. She glided in and out of his flight, confusing him. But tonight, at least, he gave her nothing to laugh about, flying evenly, if carefully, and never falling once. Tonight, the eyes did not come at all, to Bobby's great relief. He would have preferred not to have Emma either, with her slight small smile and her show-off glide, but she was better than the eyes. She at least did not frighten him. When he awoke, lying on the floor, he was stiff and sore all over, but he thought that was probably the clumsy way he had been lying, half-propped between the chair and the chest of drawers. 4 nights later, on a Sunday night, another blizzard came. Bobby was dreaming, but not the flying dream, and his waking still seemed a dream because he could not at first understand or recognize anything he heard, the screaming, banging, whistling, tearing sounds. But as he grew more awake, he began to realize that those sounds were wind, that the whole house shook with it, doors rattling, the baby wailing, but her wails just a jigsaw piece out of the storm noise, and not human or meaningful at all. Bobby reached for the curtain nearest to his bed and pulled it back. He saw the snow rush past the window, not flakes, or if they were flakes, they went too fast to be distinguishable, but more a kind of dust, whirling and furious, and so dense that it hid even the closed down shoulder, or made it seem as if that were moving too. At first, the speed of it fascinated him, but then he found such fury frightening. Too. He felt his arm grow stiff and cold from holding the curtain back so awkwardly, and with that for his excuse, not fear, he let the curtain drop and slid back into his friendly bed, where, despite the huge racket of the wind, he was soon asleep again. By morning, the wind had almost died away, but when he looked out of his window, expecting some snow landscape similar to that of the day before, he found that instead it had been quite obliterated, for the wind had swept this snow into the strangest whirligig patterns. It had swept one place almost bare and filled another with peaks and sweeps of snow, as smooth as fresh iron linen. It had buried the fence between the garden and the down, so that now they were joined, and one, just as he had always wished them to be. And on this side of the house, it had blown snow almost up to his window ledge. The new school term had been meant to start that day, but whether it did or not, Bobby was not to know, for it was impossible for him to go the 3/4 of a mile or so to get there. He was at first more disappointed than pleased by this. He liked his lessons at school, and could persuade himself, at home at least, that the teasing he got from the other children was some kind of special friendship. It would be a change, at least, from sitting at home reading or watching television or playing with the baby. But after breakfast, his father said, "Come along, Bob. There's work for you and me, digging us a patch out of here. So get your clothes on quick," at which the lazy Bobby groaned and sighed, pulling on boots and jerseys reluctantly, and wished he could read or watch television or play with the baby after all, anything rather than dig uselessly with spades at this great snow landscape. And just as he had feared, it was very hard, slow work. The delicate feathery snow felt heavy as rocks on his spade. As fast as it was shoveled away, tried to fall back again, or else let the small wind push it back. So he and his father had to beat down the snowy walls as they made them, beating hard as they could with the flat of their spades. And at first the snow powdered away under their blows, and later turned to hard and painful ice. Bobby puffed and ached and panted, grumbling with what breath he had left. But what surprised him, once the first aches wore off, was that his usual puffy muscles seemed tougher suddenly, and more able to do this work than they would have been before, though he had done nothing he could think of to bring such a change about. Indeed, a little while later, as he grew used to the work, he almost began to enjoy himself. He enjoyed, anyway, this rare change to be with his father, who worked hard and long and late, and rarely stayed at home, as the snow had forced him to today. They did not talk much, father and son, but grunted from time to time in a companionable way, and handed each other peppermints. All down the road other men worked too, digging themselves paths. They were fierce and silent with their spades, but more friendly to their neighbors than they ever usually were, leaning on their spades at intervals to grumble about the weather and offering everyone cups of tea and cake. Bobby began to forget his aches and his disappointment about the school, and his pride at being one of them, at work like the other men and sharing their tea and their cake. For 2 whole days the village was cut off, nothing and no one coming in from outside. But by the 3rd day, though, the temperature still lay well below freezing. There had been no more snow, and the village had begun to stir and to shake itself free. Snow plows came over the hill from the sea, past Bobby's house, great monsters with jaws crammed and gorged with snow. After them came other traffic, creeping cars and vans looking small and ordinary. People complained of failing electricity and frozen pipes, but at least they could get out and about to shop. And down Bobby's road they kept their tea and their cakes to themselves again, though continuing to pass the time of day in a most friendly manner, far more friendly still than they had been to each other before. School, when it started, was a whole week late. It was more like a kind of indoor picnic, even an adventure. The smaller of the classrooms was still shut off, and its class teachers snowbound on a remote farm, so that all the children, both big and little ones, were jammed together into the big classroom in charge of Miss Halibut, the desks pushed and piled to the window side to make room for them. Outside it was gray and icy still, and the lights were turned on to defeat the grim sky, and the windows tight shut to keep out the cold. So shut they kept in the dusty smell of chalk, and the dank sheep smell of the children's drying clothes, and the bitter smell of the smoke from the 2 iron stoves that steamed and growled and crackled at either end of the room, blowing smoke by turns from the joints were their 2 iron chimneys turned upward to the ceiling, but the children were too excited to mind that bitterness. The little children sat on the floor by the back stove, drawing with slates and chalk under the eye of one of the older girls. They were quiet and awed by the bigger ones, but the rest of them, chattering eagerly, made up for their quiet. As many of them as could squeezed close to the other friendly stove, leaning and banging on each other, giggling and boasting how they'd been snowed up worse than anyone, or so each of them claimed. Most had to sit on the floor, their legs crossed or their knees hunched up, but the oldest, privileged ones sat on the guard around the stove itself, perched like swallows on a telegraph wire. Emma, being the oldest in the school, perched there, but she was quite silent, gazing up at the windows as if interested only in the swing of the window cord or in the spear-sized icicles that hung down from the roof outside as far as the second window pane. Molly Scobb perched just next to Emma, but turned her back on her as much as she could without falling off the guard, chattering and giggling with her friends and making pointed comments about stuck-up girls, which Emma did not appear to hear. Molly had once been her friend, but after the flying summer she had turned against Emma, and naturally her friends did not want to be friendly with Emma either. Scooter Dimple and Jammy Hat did not believe in being friends with girls, and except for Bobby, most of the other children were much younger now than Emma. Thus, since Marley had left and Charlotte had gone to boarding school, she had no real friends at all. On the floor by Emma's feet sat Bobby Fumpkins, clasping his pudgy knees, for though the oldest boy in the school, he did not dare assert his right to a place on the guard. From time to time, he was poked in the back by Scooter Dimple or by Jammy Hat, who, when Bobby turned around to see what it was, cackled and said, "Sorry!" but cheekily, hardly as if they meant it. Yet curiously, he did not mind too much. The strange disorder knit all the children together in their enjoyment of it, big and small ones alike, and the teasing itself made Bobby feel he belonged with the rest. So he giggled wildly, when others did, and felt his face red with heat and excitement. He even dared at last to look up at Emma and ask quite boldly, "Wasn't it good, Emma, having a longer holiday because of the snow? Were you quite snowed up? We were in our house." Emma said nothing at all. She nodded slightly and smiled past Bobby's left ear, so that he dared say nothing more. He laughed instead to make up for it. Miss Halibut was waiting now, one hand on her desk, for the talk to cease. With the children so excited, she had to bang once and then again, twice, and even a third time before all the faces were turned toward her, and all the mouths were quite still. She said brightly, "Well, children, what a strange start to the term this is, but we're all going to work just as well as usual, aren't we?" "Yes, Miss Halibut," gabbled all the children except for Emma, who continued to gaze a little scornfully out of the window at the icicles. "Well," went on Miss Halibut, still brightly, "we've some changes to start with this term. I have decided to choose a head boy and girl to help me." The children stirred, rustling and whispering. The older ones' faces showed them wondering, "Is it me? Is it me?" Even the worst behaved, who knew they would not be chosen. Even Emma had ceased looking at the icicles and watched the little children with their slates. Instead, as if she wondered if the choice could fall on her, who was, after all, the oldest in the school, and besides, her bobbed and pleased face, and beside her bobbed the pleased face of Molly Scobb, equally certain it must be herself, the second eldest, who was always so helpful and so well behaved. The only person who did not wonder was Bobby. Even if he was the eldest boy in school, all the other children laughed at him, so whoever would think of making him stupid old Bobby Fumpkins head boy? Bobby certainly would not. As for Emma, it would never have occurred to her that if she should be head girl because she was the oldest girl, then Bobby should be the head boy because he was the oldest boy, any more than it would have occurred to him. Miss Halibut was smiling, touching her spectacles, tucking up her hair. She said, "Quiet, children, now, quiet. My two head children are, of course, Robert Fumpkins and Emma Makepeace, our oldest boy and girl. Stand up, Bobby and Emma, so everyone can see you. That's right, then stand up." She began to clap, and a little quietly and doubtfully at first, because of their surprise, and in some cases their disappointment, the older children began to clap too, but the clapping grew quickly louder, and in a little while a few of the bolder ones, led by Jammy and Scooter, began to stamp their feet as well as to cheer, though mockingly, at Bobby and Emma as they stood there in front of them. Bobby was red and panting a little from the hasty scramble to his feet, his head hanging, his foot tapping with embarrassment. Emma gazed over their heads at the windows again, but a little pink and shiny-eyed, clearly pleased in spite of herself. She glanced from time to time triumphantly at the scowling face of Molly Scobb, the second oldest girl. Bobby could scarcely believe it, that he, Bobby, was head boy of the school, with Emma Makepeace, his partner. For himself, he was jumping with pleasure inside, but hardly dared show his pleasure lest she was angry at sharing the glory with him. He wondered what she was thinking at this minute, and in his triumph dared even steal a look at her to see, but immediately Emma saw his eyes on her, and her smile went out, and she glared at him furiously, and then gazed hard away. Miss Halibut had seen the glare. Bobby saw her look at him, and then at Emma, frowning a little. She said, "Now, everyone, quiet, please. I think we've clapped for Bobby and Emma enough now, so sit down, both of you, and we'll get on with something else." And we'll pause there.